all data is biased. There's no such thing as neutral data, because whatever data exists reflects the biases of whoever collected that data. What questions were asked, what questions were not asked, what sensors were installed, what sensors were not installed. Take, for example, your average workplace. If management were to ask questions about the quality of health and life in that workplace, it would be completely different than the questions that were asked by a union. If a conservative government was gathering data about the environment, that might be completely different data than if a liberal government or an NDP government or a green government were collecting data about that process. So if you actually look at the phenomenology and epistemology of data collection and the way in which the scientific process works, you would see that mitigating bias and removing bias is near impossible. And that's where, being the contrarian that I am, I'm going to make the opposite argument. That bias is good. That emotions are central to how we use reason and how our brains work. If you're interested, there's a huge body of science that backs it up, and the buzzword that you can throw into Google is a phrase, ecological rationality, which talks about how emotion and reason in the brain are inseparable. But I digress. Allow me to make the argument as to why I want my algorithm biased in favor of me, right? If you think about Amazon's algorithm, it's biased in favor of Amazon because it's trying to get you to buy Amazon products or trying to get you to buy more stuff. If you think about Netflix's algorithm, the Netflix algorithm is biased in favor of Netflix to make sure that you watch another episode or you watch another movie. So if I was, for example, a Canadian citizen and the Canadian government was setting up an algorithm to help me find Canadian services and grants and programs that allow me to make the most of government services, for sure I want that algorithm biased in favor of me, the Canadian citizen. The same way that I would want an algorithm biased in favor of the Canadian Civil Service to help the Canadian Civil Service do its job more effectively and more efficiently. The same way that I might want an algorithm that's biased in favor of Canada as a larger economy. So it's important that we recognize that biases are not always bad. And here's an example. Inclusivity and accessibility is a bias. It's a good bias versus bigotry is a bad bias, right? Versus discrimination. Sometimes discrimination is good. Like, we want to build systems that discriminate against liars. And we want to build systems that discriminate against cheaters, right? And people who don't play the system fair. I mean, part of the problem right now of the soon-to-be Republican candidate for president, who was previously the president, is there aren't enough biases to weed out a clown like that from the system. So again, I'm trying to reconfigure how we think about biases, that in a democratic society, some biases are good and some biases are bad. And as a society, we come together to make those decisions, to decide those values. Now, Maurice in the chat asked about confirmation bias. And of course, they're evoking a whole range of cognitive biases, which are completely different than some of the biases like political biases or cultural biases that I'm also evoking. But cognitive biases are also incredibly important because they too tend to get embedded into artificial intelligence systems. And that's why I keep talking about literacy and why literacy and critical thinking is so essential, because we're never going to free ourselves of these cognitive biases, the same way we're not going to free our systems from these cognitive biases. So we need the whole point of a democratic system is to have checks and balances that call these biases out. right? That recognize when we're using these biases and how to bend and sort of create flexible systems that allows us to not only identify these biases, but sometimes embrace them, right? If, for example, our bias is in favor of Canadians, or if our bias is in favor of Atlantic Canadians, because maybe we want to have a regional bias in the way in which we might think of economic policy or the delivery of services. And, Samuel also pointed out that augmented intelligence would perhaps be a better definition of AI than artificial intelligence, because arguably there's nothing artificial about what we're describing,